The rain was relentless that night, hammering against the warped glass of my apartment window like 1,000 tiny fists demanding entry. I sat at my chipped wooden table, a half-empty mug of coffee, cooling in my hands, the bitter scent mingling with the damp musk of old books and linoleum. At 65, I'd grown used to the quiet of my life in Rock Springs, Wyoming, a life of small routines, smaller ambitions, and the kind of solitude that wraps around you like a worn coat. But tonight something felt off, like a shadow moving just beyond the edge of my vision. The air carried a weight, a hum of something unseen, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the world was about to tilt. I was no stranger to omens. Growing up, my grandmother used to say that rain like this, wild, unyielding, meant the spirits were restless, whispering secrets to those who'd listen. I'd laughed it off as a boy, but decades of life had taught me to pay attention when the world felt wrong. And tonight, it did. The flickering bulb above my kitchen sink buzzed like a trapped insect, and the neighbor's complaints filtered through the thin walls. Eleanor Henderson, railing about my faulty sprinkler system, drowning her prized begonias again. Jerry Flores, "You're a menace to this complex," she'd shouted earlier, her voice sharp as a cracked whip. I'd meant to fix that loose joint weeks ago, but time had a way of slipping through my fingers like water through the cracks of my life. I was mopping up a coffee spill, shards of a broken mug scattered across the floor like fragments of forgotten promises, when the phone rang. Its shrill cry cut through Eleanor's muffled tirade and the storm's endless drumming. I ignored it at first, focusing on the spreading brown stain, the way it seeped into the linoleum's worn grooves. The machine would catch it. But the ringing persisted, insistent, like a heartbeat refusing to stop. On the sixth ring, I tossed the soaked dish towel into the sink and grabbed the receiver, my hands still damp. "Jerry Flores." I said, my voice rougher than I meant, as if I'd been shouting into the void. "Mr. Flores, this is Janet Morrison from Morrison Welsh and Associates in Cheyenne." The woman's voice was smooth, professional, but laced with a careful edge that made my spine stiffen. It was the kind of tone that carried bad news wrapped in velvet to soften the blow. "I'm calling regarding Brianna Elizabeth Flores." My grip tightened on the receiver, the name slicing through me like a blade from the past. Nobody had called her Brianna Elizabeth in my presence for 15 years, not since the divorce papers were signed, sealing the end of 22 years of marriage. My heart thudded heavy and uneven, as if it knew something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. "What about her?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a pause long enough for the rain to fill the silence with its restless rhythm. "I'm very sorry to inform you, Mr. Flores, but Mrs. Flores passed away on Tuesday evening." The words hit like a physical force, knocking the air from my lungs. I sank into the nearest chair, its familiar creak too loud in the sudden quiet of my mind. Tuesday evening. 3 days ago, while I'd been wrestling with sprinklers and coffee stains, oblivious to the fact that the woman who'd once been my everything was gone. The room spun slightly, the edges blurring like a dream I couldn't wake from. "Mr. Flores, are you there?" Janet's voice pulled me back, sharp and grounding. "Yes," I said, though my voice sounded foreign, like it belonged to someone else. "How did you get my number? Your name was listed in Mrs. Flores's personal effects as an emergency contact." "I understand you were previously married." Previously married. The phrase reduced 22 years of love, laughter, and heartbreak to a cold footnote. "Yes," I said, the word automatic muscle memory from years of filling out forms. "We divorced in 2010. "I see." Another pause, this one heavier, as if she were weighing her next words carefully. "There will be a reading of the will following the funeral service this Friday at Riverside Memorial Chapel. You're named as a beneficiary, so your presence would be appreciated." Beneficiary. The word felt like a riddle, sharp and impossible. Brianna had built her empire after our divorce, turning a modest consulting business into a juggernaut that dominated headlines I only glimpsed in passing. Her wealth was a world I'd never belonged to, a glittering fortress I'd watched her construct from the shadows of my ordinary life. What could she possibly have left me? A trinket from our past, a final jab at the man who couldn't keep up with her ambition, or something else? Something that explained the strange hum in the air tonight. Mr. Flores, will you be attending? Janet's voice was patient but firm, pulling me back to the present. I glanced out the kitchen window where the rain painted silver streaks across the glass. Eleanor Henderson was outside her silhouette, hunched against the storm, inspecting her waterlogged begonias with a flashlight. Her complaints felt distant now, like echoes from a life that no longer mattered. "The chapel," I said slowly. "Where did you say it was?" "Riverside Memorial on Grand Avenue. The service begins at 2:00 p.m., followed by a brief reception. The will reading is scheduled for 4:30 at our offices downtown." I nodded, though she couldn't see me. "I'll be there." After hanging up, I sat motionless, the phone still warm in my hand. The rain's rhythm grew louder, almost musical, like a chant from some ancient ritual. Brianna was gone. Vibrant, stubborn, impossible Brianna. The woman who'd once set my world ablaze with her fire, who'd left me behind when her dreams outgrew mine. And yet she'd named me in her will. Why? The question coiled around me like smoke, thick with mystery and unspoken promises. I stood moving to the window, my reflection a ghostly outline against the storm. The coffee stain on the floor had set dark rings, spreading like a map of forgotten territories. I should have cleaned it, but my body refused to move, anchored by the weight of memories I'd buried deep. Brianna's name echoed in my mind, each syllable a key to a door I'd locked long ago. I closed my eyes, and for a moment I was back in 1987, standing in Murphy's Diner on a snowy February night, the air thick with the scent of apple pie and possibility. She'd been a vision in a red wool coat, her voice cutting through the diner's hum like a blade of light. "You're telling me you won't hire women for weekend manager because they can't handle the pressure?" She'd said her words sharp enough to make the manager flinch. I'd stopped mid-bite, my fork hovering, captivated by her fire. Her profile, sharp cheekbones, a jaw set with determination, glowed under the fluorescent lights, and I knew even then that she was a force I'd never outrun. I'd watched her slide a business card across the counter, her movements precise, deliberate. "When you decide to hire based on qualifications, call me." The door chimes sang as she left, and the diner felt emptier, as if she'd taken its warmth with her. I memorized her name, Brianna Chen, before stepping into the snow to chase a future I couldn't yet see. Back in the present, the rain's chant grew louder, almost a whisper, urging me to listen. I opened my eyes, the apartment coming back into focus. The broken mug, the coffee stain, the flickering bulb, they were all signs, weren't they? Signs that something larger was at play. Something that connected Brianna's death to the quiet strength I'd spent years cultivating in the shadows. I'd never been one for grand gestures or empires, but I'd learned to endure, to find power in the small acts of keeping the world running. Fixing sprinklers, paying bills, surviving heartbreak. And now Brianna had reached across the divide of 15 years to pull me back into her world. Why? The question burned brighter, tinged with a strange energy, as if the answer lay hidden in the storm outside, in the restless spirits my grandmother had warned me about. I didn't know what awaited me at the funeral or the will reading, but I felt a spark ignite inside me, a strength I hadn't touched in years, a resolve to face whatever truth Brianna had left behind. I turned from the window, leaving the coffee stain untouched. The rain sang on a chorus of secrets and promises, and I knew one thing for certain: this was no ordinary inheritance. Something bigger was coming, something that would test the man I'd become and reveal the man I'd always been. I'd face it not as the broken ex-husband of a titan, but as Jerry Flores, a man who'd learned to stand firm in the storm. The rain hadn't stopped its relentless patter against my apartment window, weaving a rhythm that felt like a summons pulling me back through time. I stood frozen, one hand still clutching Brianna's name like a talisman, Brianna Elizabeth Flores. The syllables were a spell, unraveling years of buried memories, each one sharp and vivid, like shards of stained glass catching forgotten light. I closed my eyes, and the storm's chant carried me to February 1987, to a snowy night in Murphy's Diner where the world had shifted beneath my feet without warning. The diner was a warm blur of fluorescent lights, and the scent of burnt coffee, a haven against the Wyoming winter, clawing at the windows. I was 27, a power plant worker with grease-stained hands and dreams no bigger than a steady paycheck. My fork hovered over a slice of apple pie when her voice cut through the hum of the nearly empty room, sharp and unyielding as a blade forged in fire. "You're telling me you won't consider women for weekend manager because they can't handle the pressure?" The woman in the red wool coat stood at the counter, her dark hair catching the light like a raven's wing. Her words weren't loud, but they carried a force that made the air tremble as if the diner itself held its breath. The manager, a balding man with a nervous tic, stammered something about policy, but she dismantled his excuses with surgical precision. "That's the most absurd thing I've heard all week," she said, her voice steady, her eyes blazing with a conviction that felt ancient, like it belonged to someone who'd argued with gods and won. "If you think women can't handle pressure, you're not just wrong, you're costing yourself talent." I forgot my pie, my fork suspended midair, my entire being tethered to her presence. She was magnificent. A storm in human form, her sharp cheekbones and determined jaw framed by the diner's harsh light. I didn't know her name yet, but I knew she was trouble, not the kind that destroys, but the kind that reshapes the world in its wake. When she slid a business card across the counter, her movements deliberate as a chess master's, I memorized every detail. Brianna Chen, business consultant. The manager muttered something about trouble as she left, the door chimes singing her exit, but I was already halfway to my feet. "She's not trouble," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "She's extraordinary." The words felt like a vow, though I didn't know it then. I pocketed her card's details before stepping into the snow, the cold biting my face as I watched her blue Honda Civic pull away, her silhouette, checking the mirrors twice before vanishing into the night. 3 days later, I found the courage to call. My hands shook as the phone rang, but her voice answered on the second ring, brisk and warm, like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Brianna Chen," she said. "This is Jerry Flores. We haven't met, but I saw you at Murphy's Diner on Friday night." I paused, my heart hammering. "You were unforgettable." A beat of silence, then a laugh, not the polite kind, but a real one, rich and unguarded. "The man with the apple pie who defended my honor." "I heard you. I was getting my gloves from the car. You left a good tip, too." I could hear the smile in her voice, and it was enough to make me bold. "Have dinner with me, somewhere better than Murphy's." Another pause, longer this time, as if she were weighing my soul through the phone line. "Are you asking me on a date, Jerry Flores, or do you need business consulting?" "Definitely a date," I said, grinning despite myself. "Though if you have advice on convincing beautiful women to have dinner with strangers, I could use the consultation." She laughed again, and I knew I was already falling. "Saturday night, Romano's on 3rd Street, 700. That night she wore the same red coat, but beneath it was a black dress that made my pulse race like a runaway train. We talked for 3 hours, her childhood in California, my days at the power plant, our shared love of old movies and dog-eared paperbacks. When she laughed at my story about flooding my apartment trying to fix a leaky faucet, her eyes sparkled with a warmth that felt like home. 6 months later, I proposed in that same diner, sliding a ring across the counter where her business card had once lain. "Marry me, Brianna Chen," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "Make me the luckiest man in Wyoming." She said yes before I'd finished asking, her smile brighter than the September sun that blazed on our wedding day. She wore her grandmother's dress, altered to fit her slender frame, and carried wildflowers we'd picked at dawn. My hands shook as I slipped the ring onto her finger, and when she whispered, "Forever," I believed her with every fiber of my being. Dustin arrived 2 years later, a red-faced miracle who filled our quiet house with chaos and purpose. I stood in the hospital room watching Brianna cradle him with the same fierce determination she brought to everything, and thought this perfect moment was all I'd ever need. But even then I noticed her eyes drifting to a business magazine on the nightstand, a flicker of ambition that hadn't been there before. It was a shadow, faint but persistent, like the first crack in a dam. The rain outside my apartment window grew louder, its rhythm shifting almost a whisper, now urging me to see what I'd missed back then. I opened my eyes, the present snapping back into focus, but the past clung to me like damp cloth. Those early years with Brianna were a tapestry of light and shadow woven with moments that felt like magic. We'd dance in our tiny kitchen to scratchy records, her laughter echoing as I spun her under the flickering bulb. We'd lie awake at night whispering dreams, hers vast and shimmering, mine small but steady, like the hum of the power grid I kept running. But as Dustin grew, the shadows deepened. When he was 7, Brianna bought him a computer. Not a toy, but a sleek machine worth more than my monthly salary. "He needs to understand technology," she said, watching him navigate programs I couldn't fathom. "The future belongs to those who think digitally." I'd suggested teaching him to fish, to feel the pull of the river and the patience it demanded. She'd laughed, but it wasn't the warm laugh of our diner days. It was sharp, dismissive, like I'd missed some unspoken test. "Fishing's fine, Jerry, but it won't prepare him for the world that's coming." We'd moved by then to Hillcrest Avenue, a house with 3 bathrooms and a kitchen island bigger than our old apartment. Brianna's consulting firm had landed a contract with a mining consortium, and suddenly money flowed like a river breaking its banks. A housekeeper came twice a week. The refrigerator dispensed ice through the door. Dustin's bedroom looked like a toy store had exploded. "Isn't this wonderful?" Brianna asked one evening, gesturing at our new dining room, its crystal chandelier glittering like a captured star. "We can finally entertain properly." I missed our old kitchen table scarred from Dustin's crayons and our late-night talks. The new one was a mirror of polished wood demanding coasters and caution reflecting every flaw. The entertaining began almost immediately. Business associates, potential clients, couples whose conversations spun around market shares and investment strategies. I'd wear my best shirt, try to keep up. But their talk of hedge funds and corporate restructuring was a language I didn't speak. "Jerry works at the power plant," Brianna would say, and I'd hear the apologetic edge in her voice, as if my life's work, keeping the lights on for thousands, was something to explain away. Dustin thrived in this new world. At 10, he could discuss coding with Brianna's tech-savvy clients. At 12, he critiqued wine choices at restaurants I couldn't afford. By 14, he rolled his eyes when I suggested camping trips, preferring Brianna's conferences in Denver or Salt Lake City. "Dad doesn't understand," became his refrain, delivered with a sigh that made me feel like a relic from a forgotten era. The first real fracture came on Dustin's 15th birthday. Brianna planned a party that looked like a corporate gala, catered food, hired entertainment, a guest list of business contacts and their polished children. I'd wanted something simpler, a barbecue in the backyard with his school friends. "This is embarrassing," I told her the night before, watching servers arrange floral centerpieces that cost more than my monthly rent. "He's 15, Brianna, not 50. She adjusted a centerpiece with the precision of a contract negotiation, her eyes cold as winter glass. "He's growing up in a different world, Jerry. These connections matter. They'll shape his future." "What about letting him be a kid?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She turned to face me, and for a moment I saw something in her eyes, not love, not anger, but a calculation so precise it chilled me. "Being a kid is a luxury we can't afford. The world is a battlefield, Jerry. Either we prepare him to win, or we watch him lose." I thought of my own 15th birthday, fishing with my father, a homemade cake, gifts wrapped in newspaper comics. It had been perfect in its simplicity. But Brianna's party was a triumph by her standards. Dustin charmed the adults, dazzled their children, received gifts that screamed wealth, laptops, designer clothes, a mountain bike worth more than my car, yet I caught him once standing alone by the pool, his face shadowed with something like confusion, a boy lost in a world too big for him. "You okay, buddy?" I asked, stepping closer. He straightened, slipping back into the persona Brianna had crafted. "Of course. Why wouldn't I be?" But for a moment I'd seen the boy beneath the polish, and it broke my heart. The rain outside my apartment slowed to a whisper, as if the storm itself were listening, waiting for what came next. I moved to the sink, the broken mug still scattered across the floor, its shards catching the dim light like pieces of a shattered spell. That party had been the beginning of the end, though I hadn't seen it then. It was the moment Brianna's ambition became a tide pulling her and Dustin away from me. I'd tried to hold on to anchor us to the life we'd built, but her dreams were a current too strong for my hands. The years that followed were a slow unraveling. Brianna's business consumed her, turning family dinners into conference calls, vacations into client meetings. Dustin's baseball games competed with boardrooms, and the boardrooms always won. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," she'd snap when I protested. "This business supports our lifestyle. Someone has to make the hard choices." But I understood pressure, the kind that came from keeping a power grid running, from ensuring thousands had light when they flipped a switch. My work served something larger than myself, a quiet strength I'd always carried even if Brianna couldn't see it. By the time Dustin graduated high school, he was a stranger molded in Brianna's image. Sharp, ambitious, dismissive of anything that didn't advance his prospects. When I suggested trade school alongside college, he looked at me like I'd proposed living in a cave. "Dad, that's the kind of thinking that's holding you back," he said at 17, his voice dripping with her cadence. "You settled for mediocrity. I won't make that mistake." The words cut deeper than I'd ever admit, not because they were true, but because they echoed Brianna's growing disdain. I'd spent 25 years keeping the lights on, a steady father, a faithful husband, but to them it was nothing. To them I was the man who couldn't keep up. The rain stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so profound it felt like a presence in the room. I knelt among the mug's shards, my hands trembling as I gathered them, each piece, a fragment of the life I'd lost. The storm had been a warning, hadn't it? A message that Brianna's death wasn't the end, but the beginning of something else, something vast and hidden, like a secret buried in the earth. Her will, her choice to name me, was no accident. It was a thread in a tapestry I couldn't yet see, woven with betrayal and redemption, power and purpose. I stood, the shards cradled in my hands, and felt a spark ignite within me. A strength I'd forgotten. A resolve as steady as the hum of the power lines I'd tended for decades. Whatever Brianna had left me, it wasn't just money or memory. It was a challenge, a summons, to step into a story I'd thought was over. And as the silence stretched, I knew I was ready to answer it. The silence in my apartment was a living thing, heavy and watchful, as if the walls themselves held their breath. The shards of the broken mug lay scattered on the linoleum, glinting like fragments of a shattered oracle, each piece whispering of a past I'd tried to bury. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the air still hummed with an electric charge, a residue of the storm's strange summons. I stood at the sink, my hands still trembling from the weight of Brianna's name, her death, her impossible inclusion of me in her will. The question why burned like a coal in my chest, but the answer lay somewhere in the years we'd lost, in the slow unraveling of the life we'd built together. I closed my eyes, and the past surged forward, pulling me into the tide of memory. It began with small cracks, barely noticeable at first, like hairline fractures in a foundation. Dustin was 7 when Brianna's ambition started to reshape our world. Her consulting firm, once a modest venture born in our old apartment, had grown into something I barely recognized, a beast with contracts and clients that stretched beyond Wyoming's borders. The money came first, then the changes. Our scarred kitchen table was replaced by a polished slab of mahogany that reflected our faces like a judgmental mirror. The house on Hillcrest Avenue, with its 3 bathrooms and chandelier-lit dining room, felt like a stranger's dream, not mine. Brianna thrived in it, her eyes alight with plans, her voice sharp with purpose. "This is our future, Jerry," she'd say, gesturing at the gleaming surfaces, the housekeeper's silent efficiency. "This is what success looks like." I didn't disagree, not out loud. I'd spent my life keeping the power grid running, ensuring thousands had light and heat with the flip of a switch. My work was steady, purposeful, but it didn't glitter. It didn't demand crystal coasters or catered dinners. I missed our old life, the late-night talks over coffee, the way Brianna's laugh used to fill our tiny kitchen like music. Now her laughter was reserved for clients, her warmth for boardrooms. And Dustin, our miracle, our boy, was slipping into her orbit away from mine. At 10, he was already her protégé. The computer she'd bought him, a sleek, expensive machine, became his world, its screen glowing with programs I couldn't understand. "He's learning to code," Brianna said, her voice proud but distant, as if explaining a language I'd never speak. "This is his future, Jerry. The world's changing and he'll be ready." I'd wanted to teach him to fish, to show him the patience of the river, the quiet strength of waiting for something real. "He's a kid," I'd said, my voice softer than I meant. "Let him play, Brianna. Let him be." She'd looked at me then, her eyes sharp with something that wasn't quite contempt but wasn't love either. Play won't build an empire, Jerry. The world doesn't wait for kids who fish. The words stung, but I let them pass, thinking time would smooth the edges. It didn't. By 12, Dustin was critiquing wine lists at restaurants I couldn't afford, his voice echoing Brianna's cadence. By 14, he was joining her at business conferences, his suitcase packed with tailored shirts and ambition. Dad doesn't understand, he'd say, rolling his eyes, when I suggested a family camping trip. The phrase became a refrain, a blade that cut deeper, each time carving a chasm between us. The house on Hillcrest became a stage for Brianna's vision. Dinners turned into networking events, the dining room filled with strangers who spoke of market shares and acquisitions. I'd sit at the edge of their conversations, my power plant stories falling flat against their talk of hedge funds. Jerry keeps the lights on, Brianna would say, her smile tight, apologetic, as if my life's work was a quaint hobby. I felt like a ghost in my own home haunting a world I hadn't chosen. But there were moments fleeting fragile when the old Brianna surfaced. Late at night, when the house was quiet, she'd slip into the kitchen where I sat with my coffee, her hair loose, her guard down. "Remember Murphy's Diner," she'd say, her voice soft, almost wistful. "You and your apple pie looking at me like I was the only thing in the room." "I still look at you that way," I'd reply, and for a moment her eyes would soften, the fire dimming to a glow. But then her phone would buzz a client, a crisis, and she'd be gone again, pulled back into the empire she was building. The rain's absence left a void outside my apartment, the silence thick with echoes of those lost moments. I knelt among the mug's shards, my fingers brushing their edges, and felt a strange pulse in the air like a heartbeat from another world. My grandmother's voice whispered in my mind, "When the world goes quiet, Jerry, listen." The spirits speak in the pauses. I shook my head, dismissing the thought, but the feeling lingered, as if the past wasn't just memory, but a presence watching, waiting. Dustin's 15th birthday was the breaking point. Brianna planned a party that looked like a corporate gala, catered hors d'oeuvres, a string quartet, a guest list of business associates and their polished offspring. I'd wanted something simpler, a backyard barbecue with his school friends' laughter and paper plates. "This is embarrassing," I told her the night before, watching servers arrange floral centerpieces that cost more than my car. "He's a kid, Brianna. Let him have a kid's party." She turned to me, her hands still adjusting a centerpiece with surgical precision. "He's not just a kid, Jerry. He's growing up in a world we didn't have. These connections will open doors. They'll shape his future." "And what about his present?" I asked, my voice rising despite myself. "What about us? What about being a family?" Her eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw something cold and unfamiliar, a calculation, a wall. "Family doesn't pay for his future, Jerry. Success does. The world is a battlefield, and I'm arming him to win." I thought of my own 15th birthday, my father's fishing rod, a homemade cake, the warmth of a day unburdened by ambition. It had been enough. But Brianna's party was a spectacle, a showcase of her empire. Dustin moved through it like a young prince, charming the adults, dazzling their children with talk of coding and markets. He received gifts that screamed wealth. A laptop designer clothes a mountain bike that cost more than my annual bonus. But I caught him once standing alone by the pool, his reflection rippling in the water, his face shadowed with something like doubt. "You okay, buddy?" I asked, stepping closer. He straightened his mask, slipping back into place. "Of course. Why wouldn't I be?" But his eyes betrayed him, a flicker of the boy who'd once begged me to read him bedtime stories. It was the last time I saw that boy, and it broke something inside me. The years that followed were a slow-motion catastrophe, like watching a storm gather on the horizon, knowing you can't outrun it. Brianna's business consumed her entirely. Weekend dinners became conference calls. Vacations were canceled for client emergencies. Dustin's baseball games, his school plays, his quiet moments of need, they all lost to her board meetings. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," she'd say when I protested, her voice sharp as broken glass. "This business is our life. Someone has to make the hard choices." But I understood pressure. I'd spent my life at the power plant, balancing the grid's delicate dance, ensuring thousands had light and warmth. My pressure served others, not myself. It was a quiet strength, a steady hand in the dark, But to Brianna, it was invisible. To Dustin, it was irrelevant. By the time Dustin graduated high school, he was a stranger molded in Brianna's image, sharp, ambitious, contemptuous of anything that didn't serve his ascent. When I suggested trade school alongside college, he laughed a sound so like Brianna's dismissive chuckle, it made my chest ache. "Dad, that's exactly the kind of thinking that's holding you back," he said, 17 and already speaking like a CEO. "You settled for mediocrity. I won't." The words were a blade cutting through the last threads of our bond. Mediocrity, as if keeping a city's lights on was nothing. As if being a father who showed up, who loved without condition, was a failure. I wanted to shake him, to tell him that strength wasn't measured in dollars or titles, but in the quiet acts of holding a family together. But he was already gone, lost to Brianna's world. The final fracture came during Dustin's senior year. Brianna was working 100-hour weeks on a massive acquisition deal, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion but alight with triumph. I'd taken over the house, groceries, laundry, the mundane tasks that kept life running. When she missed Dustin's graduation for a client crisis, I couldn't hold back anymore. I found her in the kitchen at midnight, still in her business suit, her phone glowing with emails. "This is enough, Brianna," I said, my voice steady but raw. "Family has to come first sometimes." She looked up, her face a mask of fatigue and defiance. "Don't lecture me about priorities, Jerry. Everything we have, Dustin's future, this house, our life, it's because of my work." "What about what we've lost?" I asked, stepping closer. "What about us? What about being a family instead of a corporation?" She stared at me, and in her eyes I saw the truth before she spoke it. We weren't a family anymore. We were a contract, a transaction that had outlived its purpose. "Maybe it's time we stopped pretending this works," she said quietly, her voice like the final note of a song. The divorce took 6 months. Brianna's lawyers were a machine, efficient, relentless, devastating. I got the old house on Maple Street, a rental property she'd kept from our early days, and enough money to live modestly. She got everything else: the empire, the chandelier, Dustin's loyalty. "You're holding him back too," Dustin told me during our last real conversation, his voice cold with conviction. "All this talk of family values and simple living. It's toxic, Dad. I can't be around that." I stood in the empty house on Maple Street, surrounded by boxes of memories that meant nothing to the people I'd loved most. The silence was deafening, but it wasn't empty. It carried a weight, a presence, as if the walls held the echoes of every fight, every unspoken apology. My grandmother's voice whispered again. "The spirits speak in the pauses, Jerry. Listen for what's left unsaid." Back in my apartment, I stood, the mug's shards still in my hands, their edges biting into my palms. The silence was different now, charged with something I couldn't name, a pulse, a promise. Brianna's death had stirred something like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples through time. Her will, her naming me as a beneficiary, was no accident. It was a thread in a larger design, a tapestry, woven with betrayal and redemption, secrets and truths. I set the shards on the counter, arranging them like a puzzle I couldn't yet solve. The air hummed again, a faint vibration, as if the world itself were waiting for me to step forward. I'd spent 15 years believing I was the man who'd failed, the one who couldn't keep up. But now I felt a spark ignite within me, a strength forged in the quiet acts of endurance, in the love I'd never stopped carrying even when it burned. Whatever Brianna had left me, it was more than money. It was a summons, a challenge to reclaim the man I'd been, the man who'd loved her fiercely, who'd stood steady in the face of loss. The storm had passed, but its message lingered, whispering of mysteries yet to unfold, of a power I'd only begun to understand. The morning of Brianna's funeral dawned cold and gray, the Wyoming sky heavy with clouds that seemed to press down on Rock Springs like a lid on a forgotten jar. I stood before my bathroom mirror, adjusting a tie I hadn't worn in years, its silk threads catching the dim light like a relic from a life I barely recognized. My reflection stared back, silver hair where brown once thrived, lines etched deep from years of quiet endurance. At 65, I was a man shaped by loss, but today something stirred within me, a pulse of strength I hadn't felt since the days I'd loved Brianna with reckless abandon. The air hummed faintly as it had the night of Janet Morrison's call, a whisper of something unseen urging me forward. My grandmother's words echoed in my mind, "When the spirits gather, Jerry, they demand you listen." I straightened my tie, squared my shoulders, and stepped into the storm. The drive to Riverside Memorial Chapel took me through Rock Springs' fractured landscape, past my modest apartment complex, through middle-class subdivisions, and into the manicured enclaves where Brianna's world thrived. The chapel loomed on a hill, its Gothic spires piercing the clouds like needles, a monument to permanence and wealth. The parking lot was a gallery of excess Mercedes sedans, BMW SUVs, Teslas, that gleamed with the arrogance of money. My 15-year-old Honda sputtered between a Lexus and a Cadillac, an interloper in a world that had long since cast me out. I parked my hands lingering on the steering wheel, feeling the weight of what awaited inside. The air was thick with that same electric hum, as if the chapel itself were alive, watching, waiting for me to cross its threshold. Inside the chapel whispered of power mahogany pews polished to a mirror's sheen, stained glass windows casting kaleidoscopes of somber light, flowers arranged with the precision of a ritual. At least 200 people filled the space, their murmurs a low hum of grief and opportunity mourning laced with the subtle cadence of business networking. I recognized faces from the dinners Brianna used to drag me to, sharp-eyed executives, polished consultants, all part of her empire. They were strangers now, inhabitants of a life she'd built after me. I slipped into a back pew, hoping to vanish into the shadows, but the air shifted as I sat, a ripple of whispers spreading like a spell gone wrong. Her ex-husband. Can you believe he showed up after everything he did to her? The words drifted from a woman in a tailored black suit, her discreet gesture pointing my way. I caught fragments of their narrative, a story spun over years. Jerry Flores, the man who'd held Brianna back, the anchor who'd nearly drowned her brilliance. I'd learned long ago not to fight their tales. People needed villains, and I was an easy one to cast. But the hum in the air grew louder, a vibration that felt like a warning urging me to hold my ground. Then I heard it, a voice sharp as a blade cutting through the chapel's murmur. Dad. Dustin strode down the aisle, his presence a storm of its own. At 37, he was Brianna's mirror-sharp cheekbones, a commanding posture, dressed in a suit that cost more than my monthly rent. His eyes, though, were all fire, burning with disbelief and barely contained rage. Success radiated from him, an aura of confidence that made the crowd part like water. But there was something else in his gaze, something brittle like glass on the verge of shattering. The hum in the air spiked a pulse that seemed to sync with my heartbeat. What are you doing here? His voice carried across the chapel, silencing conversations and turning heads. The crowd leaned in, spectators to a drama they hadn't expected. I stood slowly, meeting his gaze. I came to pay my respects. You lost that right 15 years ago. He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne. Something sharp, expensive, like ambition distilled into scent. She wouldn't want you here. Maybe not, I said, my voice steady despite the weight of 200 judgmental stares. But I needed to be here. For what? His tone was venomous, loud enough to echo off the chapel's stone walls. To ease your conscience, to play the grieving widower for people who know exactly who you are. The chapel fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. I felt the familiar pressure of judgment, the same suffocating weight I'd carried during our marriage's final years. But today something was different. The hum in the air was no longer a whisper. It was a song, low and resonant, like a chorus of unseen voices urging me to stand firm. I had nothing left to lose, and that was its own kind of power. I'm not here to cause trouble, Dustin. I said, my voice calm but unyielding. I'll sit in the back. I won't speak to anyone. When the service ends, I'll leave. You'll leave now. His voice rose, drawing murmurs of approval from the crowd. You embarrassed her enough when she was alive. Don't make this worse by pretending to care now. The words stung, but they didn't break me. I held his stare, feeling the hum in the air pulse stronger, as if it were feeding on my resolve. Around us, the crowd buzzed, a cough, a vibrating phone, the rustle of programs. I could have walked away, spared myself the humiliation, but something held me there. A spark of strength I hadn't touched in years. My grandmother's voice whispered again. The spirits stand with the steadfast Jerry. Don't run. Before I could respond, Dustin turned to the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to commanding rooms. I apologize for this disruption during a time meant for remembrance. He gestured toward me with a flick of his wrist, dismissive as swatting a fly. My father seems to have forgotten that divorce means you're no longer family. A few heads nodded, whispers of agreement rippling through the pews. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, but I forced myself to stay calm, rooted by that strange hum, that unseen presence. Dustin warmed to his audience, his voice growing sharper, more theatrical. For those who don't know, this is Jerry Flores, the man who spent 22 years holding back one of the most brilliant women this town ever produced. The crowd leaned in, their eyes glinting with the thrill of a public trial. While my mother built an empire that employed hundreds, he was content punching a time clock, complaining about her ambition. His words were a performance, each one landing like a stone. He took half her assets in the divorce, despite contributing nothing to her success. Then he spent 15 years playing the victim while she created something magnificent. The accusations weren't new, but they cut deeper in this sacred space, surrounded by people who'd chosen their narrative long ago. I saw familiar faces, former neighbors, people I'd once called friends, none meeting my eyes. And now Dustin continued, his voice rising to a crescendo. He shows up expecting sympathy, expecting to be treated like he mattered in her life. Each word was a blade, not because it was entirely true, but because it twisted our shared history into a story of failure and blame. I wanted to defend myself, to explain the love we'd shared, the nights we'd danced in our kitchen, the promises we'd made. But what was the point? This crowd had made up its mind years ago, yet the hum in the air grew louder, a vibration that seemed to coil around me, strengthening my resolve. She deserved a husband who'd have lifted her up, Dustin said, his voice thick with conviction. Not one who dragged her down to his level. The chapel was silent now, the weight of their stares pressing against me like a physical force. Part of me wanted to flee, to escape the humiliation, but the hum held me fast, a reminder of something larger at play. I thought of Brianna, of the woman who'd once loved me fiercely, who'd promised me forever. I thought of the mysterious will, the unanswered question of why she'd named me. And I felt it, a spark, a quiet power rising within me, forged in years of endurance, of loving without reward. "Are you finished?" I asked, my voice low but clear, cutting through the silence like a bell. Dustin's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise breaking his composure. He'd expected me to crumble, to slink away in shame. When I didn't, his confidence wavered just for a moment. "I loved your mother for 40 years, I said, my words carrying through the chapel, steady and true. 22 as her husband, 18 more as someone who wished her well, despite everything that broke between us. I'm not here to claim anything. I'm here because once we made promises that mattered, and I choose to honor them." I sat back down, folding my hands in my lap, the hum in the air, settling into a soft, approving pulse. The crowd was silent, their anticipation disrupted by my refusal to bow. Dustin stood frozen in the aisle, his script thrown off by my resistance. "The service will begin in 5 minutes, the funeral director announced, his voice a lifeline to order. Dustin shot me a final look of contempt before striding to the front pew reserved for family. As the murmurs resumed, I caught fragments of gossip. The nerve of him, poor Dustin, should have stayed home, but they felt distant, like echoes from another world. The hum was my anchor now, a reminder that I wasn't just the man they'd painted. I was Jerry Flores, who'd kept the lights on for thousands, who'd loved Brianna through her fire, and her frost, who'd carried the weight of loss without breaking. The service began, a parade of eulogies, painting Brianna as a visionary who'd triumphed over obstacles. Business associates spoke of her leadership, her innovation. Music swelled, emphasizing her victories. I listened, my heart heavy with memories they'd never know. The woman who'd laughed in my arms, who'd whispered forever under a September sky. When it ended, the crowd filed past Dustin, offering condolences with practiced grace, their eyes sliding over me like I was invisible. I waited until the chapel was nearly empty, ready to slip out through a side door to retreat to my quiet life. But a voice stopped me, sharp and professional, cutting through the lingering hum. "Mr. Flores." Dan Morrison approached, a man in an expensive suit, his leather briefcase a shield of authority. Middle-aged, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, he carried the air of someone who'd seen wealth's secrets and kept them close. "Dan Morrison, Morrison, Welsh, and Associates. Could I have a word? The hum spiked again, a sudden jolt that made my skin prickle. I nodded, feeling the weight of his gaze, the weight of something unspoken. After the service, he said, glancing around the emptying chapel. There are matters we need to discuss regarding Mrs. Flores's estate. Dustin appeared at my shoulder, his expression shifting from grief to alert interest. Dan, finally, he said, his voice smooth but edged with impatience. When do we handle the business side of things? Of course, Dustin. Dan replied, his tone measured like a man delivering a verdict. I'd like both of you to come to my office for the reading of the will. Both of us. Dustin's eyebrows rose, his tone sharp with disbelief. He gestured vaguely toward me as if I were an afterthought. Is that necessary? Your father is named in the will? Dan said, his eyes meeting mine with a look. I couldn't read sympathy, perhaps, or something deeper, like he knew a secret I hadn't yet grasped. His presence is required by law. I felt a jolt, like the hum had solidified into a spark, igniting something within me. Named in the will. It made no sense, not after 15 years of silence, not after the life Brianna had built without me. Was it a formality? A final gesture of closure, or something else? Something tied to the strange pulse in the air. The whispers of spirits my grandmother had taught me to heed. Dustin's annoyance was palpable, but he shrugged, his confidence unshaken. Fine, let's get this over with. Try not to make this difficult, Dad. I didn't respond, my mind racing with questions, the hum now a steady rhythm, like a heartbeat guiding me forward. As we left the chapel, the clouds parted briefly, a shaft of light cutting through the gray, illuminating the path to Dan's office. I felt it then, a certainty, a strength rising like a tide. Whatever awaited me, it was no accident. Brianna had left me something, not just in her will, but in the fabric of this moment, woven with mystery and purpose. And I would face it not as the man they'd dismissed, but as the man I'd always been, steady in the storm, ready for the truth. The walk to Dan Morrison's office felt like crossing a threshold into another world. The streets of downtown Rock Springs were quiet, the gray clouds parting to let slivers of sunlight pierce the pavement, each ray sharp as a blade. The hum that had followed me since the night of Janet's call was stronger now, a low resonant pulse that seemed to vibrate in my bones, as if the town itself were holding its breath. Dustin strode ahead, his tailored suit a stark contrast to my worn jacket, his steps clipped with the confidence of a man who believed he owned the future. I followed, my heart steady but heavy, the weight of Brianna's will, her final act, pulling me forward like a current I couldn't resist. Dan's office occupied the top floor of a restored Victorian house, its dark wood and leather-bound books exuding a quiet authority. Certificates lined the walls, interspersed with photographs of Dan shaking hands with local dignitaries, their smiles frozen in time. The space was a shrine to success, the kind Brianna had revered, but it felt alive with something else, a stillness that echoed the hum in my chest, as if the room itself knew secrets it wasn't ready to share. My grandmother's voice whispered in my mind, "When the world holds its breath, Jerry truths come to light." I shook off the thought, but the air seemed to shimmer like heat rising from summer asphalt. "Please have a seat," Dan said, gesturing to two leather chairs before his mahogany desk. Dustin claimed the one closest to him, leaving me the slightly off-center seat, a fitting metaphor for my place in this drama. Dan settled behind the desk, his movements precise, as he opened a thick file, extracting a stack of legal documents with the care of a priest handling sacred texts. The afternoon light slanted through tall windows, casting dust motes that danced like tiny spirits, their movements synchronized with the hum that pulsed stronger, now almost audible. "Before we begin," Dan said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "I want to express my condolences again. Brianna was not only a valued client but a friend. Her loss is profound." His voice was steady, professional, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a hint of something unspoken, as if he knew the weight of what was coming. Dustin nodded solemnly, his hands clasped with the anticipation of a man ready to claim his birthright. I remained silent, my fingers tracing the armrest, feeling the hum resonate through the leather, as if it were urging me to brace myself. Dan lifted the first document, several pages bound with a blue backing, and cleared his throat. "This is the last will and testament of Brianna Elizabeth Flores, executed on March 15, 2024, and properly witnessed according to Wyoming state law. It supersedes all previous wills and codicils. The date struck me 14 months ago. Why had Brianna rewritten her will so recently? Had she sensed her time was near? The hum pulsed sharper, a warning or a promise I couldn't tell. Dan's voice took on a formal cadence, each word deliberate. The will confirms that Mrs. Flores was of sound mind and free of undue influence or coercion when these documents were prepared. Dustin leaned forward, his posture taut with expectation, a prince awaiting his crown. I shifted in my chair, feeling like an intruder in a ritual not meant for me. Why was I here? A formality, perhaps a minor bequest to close the chapter of our marriage. But the hum told me otherwise, its rhythm quickening like a heartbeat racing toward truth. Dan turned to the second page, his glasses catching the light as he read. I hereby make the following specific bequests and devises. To my beloved son, Dustin Michael Flores, I leave the family home at 847 Hillcrest Avenue, along with all furnishings, artwork, and personal property contained therein. Dustin's lips curved into a satisfied smile, his shoulders relaxing. The Hillcrest house was a jewel $800,000, maybe more, with mountain views and space for the kind of entertaining Brianna had loved. It was a fitting inheritance, a piece of her empire. But the hum in my chest tightened, as if it knew something Dustin didn't. Additionally, Dan continued, his voice unwavering, I bequeath to Dustin the sum of $500,000 to be transferred from my primary investment account within 60 days of probate. Dustin's smile flickered just for a moment, a shadow crossing his face. $500,000 was a fortune to most, but I could see him calculating, his mind racing through the math of Brianna's empire. Her company, her investments, her vast portfolio. Where was the rest? The hum grew louder, a low chant that seemed to coil around the room, drawing my attention to Dan's careful neutrality. That's generous, of course, Dustin said, his voice smooth but laced with uncertainty. But what about Mom's business? The company. Dan set down the first page, lifting the next with a deliberate pause. I'm continuing with the specific bequests, Dustin. Please allow me to finish. His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it, a warning that made the hum spike, sharp and electric. I shifted again, the leather creaking under me, feeling the weight of eyes I couldn't see. The room seemed to hold its breath, the dust motes frozen in their dance. Dan's voice resumed, steady but heavy, as if each word carried a burden. The bequest to Dustin includes the following conditions. The inheritance is contingent upon his continued employment with Flores Consulting Solutions for a minimum of 2 years following the date of this will's execution, or until such time as the company is sold or dissolved. Dustin's confidence cracked, his hands unclenching and reclenching in his lap. Conditions. His voice was sharp-edged with disbelief. What kind of conditions? And what do you mean sold? Who would sell the company? It was her life's work. I'm reading the will as written. Dan said, his eyes steady behind his glasses. These are your mother's words, not mine. The hum was a roar now, a tidal wave of sound that only I seemed to hear. It pulsed in my chest, my temples urging me to listen, to see what was coming. Dustin's voice rose, his composure fraying. Let me get this straight. I get the house and $500,000, but there are strings attached, and you're talking about the company being sold? That makes no sense. Mom would never let that happen. Dan removed his glasses, cleaning them with a slow, deliberate motion, as if giving us time to brace for the storm. Your mother's will contains additional provisions that address the disposition of her remaining assets, he said quietly. The company, her investment portfolio, and other significant holdings. Then let's hear them. Dustin demanded, his patience thinning to a thread. What are these provisions? I watched, my heart pounding, the hum now a chorus of whispers urging me toward a truth I wasn't ready to face. Dan's manner shifted, his voice taking on a weight that made my stomach tighten. Before I continue, I must emphasize that these documents reflect Mrs. Flores's final considered wishes. They were prepared after extensive consultation, and she was adamant about their contents. The room fell silent save for the tick of an antique clock on Dan's bookshelf, its rhythm syncing with the hum in my chest. Dustin stared at the lawyer, his eyes blazing with alarm, while I sat frozen, the question of why burning brighter than ever. Why had Brianna insisted I be here? What was she planning? Dan lifted the third page, his eyes scanning the text before meeting mine with a look that sent a chill down my spine. Sympathy, obligation, and something deeper, like he was delivering a prophecy. However, he said, his voice heavy as stone, the will contains provisions that fundamentally alter the distribution of Mrs. Flores's estate. He paused, the silence stretching like a taut wire, and then he read his words falling into the room like thunder. To my former husband, Jerry Michael Flores, I bequeath the sum of $33.5 million to be transferred from my primary investment accounts and securities portfolio. The world tilted, the air rushing out of the room as if sucked into a void. My mouth fell open, a reflex. I couldn't control the number so vast it felt like a dream. $33.5 million. It was a figure that didn't belong in my world, a world of coffee stains and sprinkler repairs, of quiet nights in a modest apartment. The hum roared a triumphant crescendo as if it had known this all along. There must be a mistake, I said, my voice a hoarse whisper, sounding like it came from someone else. Did you say $33.5 million? Yes, Dan replied, his tone calm but his eyes watchful, as if he'd anticipated the chaos unfolding. $33.5 million. Dustin's face drained of color, then flushed red, his breath coming in sharp gasps. What did you just say? His voice was a blade cutting through the hum's resonance. Dan pressed on undeterred, his voice steady as he dropped the second bombshell. Additionally, I transfer to Jerry Flores, controlling interest in Flores Consulting Solutions, including all subsidiary companies, real estate holdings, and business assets. This transfer includes 65% ownership of all corporate entities and an appointment as chairman of the board of directors. The room spun, the hum now a deafening chorus that seemed to shake the walls. Controlling interest in Brianna's company, the empire that had consumed our marriage, that had made me feel small and inadequate, was now mine. I couldn't breathe, the weight of it crushing, impossible. This wasn't just money. It was power, responsibility, a legacy I'd never sought. This can't be right, I said, my voice barely audible. There has to be an error. I assure you, Mr. Flores, there is no error. Dan removed his glasses again, cleaning them with that same methodical precision as if anchoring himself in routine. These documents were prepared under Mrs. Flores's direct supervision. She reviewed every word multiple times and confirmed these were her exact wishes. Dustin shot to his feet, his chair slamming against the wall with a crack that echoed like gunfire. This is impossible. His voice was raw, trembling with disbelief and rage. She wouldn't. She couldn't. He whirled toward me, his eyes wild, a mix of fury and betrayal. What did you do? How did you manipulate her? I didn't do anything, I said, my voice weak, still grappling with the impossibility of it all. I haven't spoken to your mother in 15 years. Liar. The word exploded from him, a gunshot in the quiet office. People don't give away $33 million to their ex-husbands for no reason. You got to her somehow when she was sick, when she wasn't thinking clearly. Dan's voice cut through the chaos, calm but authoritative. I can assure you, Mr. Flores, that Mrs. Flores was of completely sound mind when she executed these documents. She underwent a thorough mental competency evaluation to prevent any challenges to the will's validity. I sat frozen. The hum now, a storm within me, its rhythm urging me to hold fast, to face the truth head on. The numbers Dan had read: $33.5 million, 65% of a multi-million-dollar company, belonged to a world I'd never touched. A world I'd watched Brianna build from the ashes of our marriage. Why would she do this? The question burned brighter than ever, tangled with the hum's strange song, as if the answer were a secret woven into the fabric of this moment. Why, I asked, the words slipping out raw and desperate. Why would she do this? Dan gathered the documents into a neat stack, his movements deliberate, as if handling something sacred. Mrs. Flores left specific instructions regarding that question, Mr. Flores. She asked me to share a personal message with you after reading these provisions. Dustin's face contorted, his rage now laced with something deeper. Pain, betrayal, a son's shattered expectations. A personal message, he spat, pointing at me with a shaking finger. She left him a message but cut me out of everything that mattered. You're talking about hundreds of millions in assets. The company alone is worth more than everything else combined. You received a substantial inheritance. Dustin Dan said, his voice calm but firm. $500,000 and a valuable property are more than most see in a lifetime. Compared to him, Dustin's voice cracked, his finger still aimed at me like a weapon. He gets everything and I get scraps. This is fraud, criminal fraud. She was manipulated, coerced, mentally compromised. He slammed his palm on Dan's desk papers, scattering like leaves in a storm. The hum surged, a wave of sound that seemed to wrap around me, shielding me from his fury. Dustin, I said quietly, finding a reserve of strength I hadn't known I had. I swear I had no contact with your mother. I didn't know she was sick. Liar, he screamed, his voice breaking the room, pulsing with his rage. Nobody gives away their life's work to someone who abandoned their family. Someone who didn't even call when she was dying. She didn't abandon anyone, I said, my voice steady now, the hum lending me its strength. Our marriage ended, but that doesn't mean it means exactly that. Dustin's voice was a near shriek, his face twisted with years of resentment. You walked away from us. You took your pathetic settlement and disappeared while she built an empire. And now you expect me to believe she just decided to hand it all to you, Mr. Flores. Dan interjected, his professional patience strainings. I understand this is difficult, but these are your mother's clearly stated wishes executed with full legal authority. Dustin spun toward Dan, his eyes blazing. I want every document examined. Psychiatric evaluations, phone records, every contact this man had with my mother in the past 5 years. There were no contacts, Dan said calmly, his eyes steady. Mrs. Flores made that clear when she explained her decision. Explained her decision. Dustin's laugh was bitter, sharp as broken glass. So she explained why she betrayed her only son and gave everything to the man who ruined her marriage. She left a message for your father. Dan said, his voice softening as if he sensed the pain beneath Dustin's rage. It's meant to explain her reasoning. The word father hit Dustin like a physical blow, his rage flickering to reveal a deeper wound, a son's desperate need for his mother's approval. The hum softened, almost mournful, as if it felt his pain too. I sat there overwhelmed, the weight of Brianna's choice settling over me like a mantle. $33.5 million, a company I'd never understood, a legacy that had torn us apart. And yet the hum whispered that this was no accident, that Brianna had seen something in me, something I'd forgotten but was now rising to the surface. The office was silent save for the clock's relentless tick and the hum's quiet song. I felt it then, a spark, a strength forged in years of quiet endurance, of loving without reward, of standing firm in the face of loss. Whatever Brianna had planned, it was a summons, a challenge to step into a role I'd never imagined. And as Dustin's rage burned, and Dan prepared to reveal the next piece of the puzzle, I knew the truth was coming, carried on the wings of that mysterious hum, ready to reshape my world. The air in Dan Morrison's office was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the relentless tick of the antique clock and the faint hum that pulsed in my chest, a chorus of unseen voices that seemed to know more than I did. Dustin stood rigid, his hands clenched into fists, his face a storm of rage and betrayal. The $33.5 million and controlling interest in Brianna's empire still hanging between us like a guillotine. I sat frozen, my mind reeling, the weight of her bequest pressing against me like a physical force. Why, the question burned a fire fed by the hum's insistent rhythm, urging me toward a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to face. Dan Morrison adjusted his glasses, his movements deliberate, as if he were handling a sacred relic. The documents on his desk lay in a neat stack, their edges sharp against the mahogany, but his attention shifted to a single envelope sealed with a wax stamp that bore Brianna's initials, BEF. The sight of it sent a jolt through me, the hum spiking into a crescendo, as if the envelope itself were alive, pulsing with her presence. As I mentioned, Dan said, his voice steady but soft, carrying the weight of a man delivering a prophecy, Mrs. Flores left a personal message to accompany the reading of her will. She requested that it be read aloud to both of you in this setting to provide clarity for her decisions. Dustin's eyes narrowed, his jaw tight with suspicion. A letter. His voice was sharp, almost mocking, but there was a tremor beneath it, a crack in his polished facade. What, some heartfelt apology for cutting me out of her legacy? Dan's expression remained impassive, but his eyes flicked to me a fleeting look that carried a mix of sympathy and resolve. It's not an apology, Dustin. It's an explanation. Your mother was meticulous in ensuring her intentions were clear. He lifted the envelope, his fingers brushing the wax seal, and I swore I saw a faint shimmer in the air, like the dust motes from earlier had returned, dancing in a pattern only they understood. My grandmother's voice whispered in my mind unbidden, "When the spirits speak, Jerry, they use the words of the living." I shook off the thought, but the hum was undeniable now, a low resonant song that seemed to weave itself into the room's very fabric, urging me to listen. Dan broke the seal with a soft crack, the sound echoing like a door unlocking, and unfolded a single sheet of cream-colored paper, its edges worn, as if Brianna had held it close before sealing it away. He cleared his throat, his voice taking on a reverent tone as if reading from a sacred text. "My dearest Jerry and Dustin," he began, and the words hit me like a physical blow, her voice echoing through time, as vivid as the nights we'd spent whispering in our old kitchen. "If you're hearing this, I'm gone, and I've left behind a world that's both richer and poorer for my choices. This letter is my attempt to explain, to heal what I broke, and to set you both on paths I hope you'll understand." Dustin snorted a sharp sound that cut through the hum song, but he leaned forward, his eyes locked on the letter, hungry for answers. I sat still, my hands gripping the armrests, the hum urging me to brace for what was coming. Dan continued, his voice steady, channeling Brianna's words with a clarity that made my chest ache. "Jerry," Dan read, "you were the first person to see me, truly see me, in that diner all those years ago. You saw not just the fire, but the heart beneath it, the woman who wanted to love and be loved. You gave me 22 years of that love, steady and unwavering, even when I pushed you away. I've spent the last 15 years regretting that I didn't listen when you tried to save us, when you begged me to choose family over ambition. You were right, and I was too proud to admit it." Tears pricked my eyes, a sudden heat that blurred the room. The hum softened, almost mournful, as if it felt her regret too. I saw her in my mind, Brianna, in her red coat, her laugh lighting up Murphy's diner, her hand in mine as we danced under a flickering bulb. I'd loved her fiercely, even when she'd chosen her empire over me, and now her words reached across the divide, a bridge I hadn't expected. Dan's voice continued, each word a weight. "I built an empire, but it came at a cost. I lost you, Jerry, and in doing so I lost a piece of myself. I lost the man who taught me that strength isn't just in success, but in the quiet acts of keeping the world running, fixing sprinklers, paying bills, loving without reward. You were the heart of our family, and I didn't see it until it was too late." Dustin shifted his breath, hitching, but he said nothing, his eyes fixed on the letter as if it were a weapon aimed at him. The hum pulsed stronger, a rhythm that seemed to sync with my heartbeat, urging me to hold fast. Dan read on, Brianna's words flowing like a river, carrying us toward truth. "Dustin," she continued, and I saw him flinch, his hands tightening into fists. "You are my greatest pride, my brilliant boy who inherited my fire. But I fear I've done you a disservice. I raised you to chase success, to measure your worth in achievements and wealth, and in doing so I let you believe your father was less than he is. I let you see his quiet strength as weakness, his love as mediocrity. That was my failure, not his." Dustin's face twisted, a mix of pain and defiance, his eyes darting to me and away again. The hum grew louder, a chorus of whispers that seemed to echo Brianna's regret, urging him to listen. "I've watched you grow into a man of ambition," Dan read, "but ambition without heart is a hollow victory. You're not ready to carry the weight of my empire, not because you lack talent, but because you haven't learned to build from nothing, to value people over profit, to forgive those who've disappointed you." "You've given me nothing," Dustin muttered, his voice low, trembling with hurt. "You gave it all to him." Dan paused, his eyes meeting Dustin's with a quiet compassion. "She explains that, Dustin. Let me finish." He turned back to the letter, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of her words. "That's why I've left the company and the majority of my estate to Jerry. Not because I love you less, Dustin, but because I trust him to use it wisely to honor the values I failed to uphold. Jerry has a strength I never fully appreciated, a strength that endures, that serves without seeking glory. He'll use this wealth to create something good, something lasting not just for himself but for others. I couldn't breathe, the words sinking into me like rain into parched earth. The hum was a symphony now, its notes weaving through Brianna's confession, affirming her faith in me. I saw flashes of our life together, the diner, our wedding. Dustin's birth, the nights we'd held each other when the world felt too big. She'd seen me, even after all these years, seen the man I'd tried to be. Tears spilled down my cheeks, and I didn't bother to wipe them away, the hum wrapping around me like a shield. To Dustin, Dan continued, I leave the house and $500,000, but more than that, I leave you a challenge. Learn to build your own path as I did, as your father did in his own way. Work at the company, learn its heart, not just its profits, and most importantly, learn to forgive. Forgive your father for being human, for loving you in ways you didn't understand. Forgive me for teaching you to value the wrong things. Your inheritance isn't just money. It's a chance to become the man I know you can be. Dustin's hands shook, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, his rage giving way to something rawer, more vulnerable. The hum softened, almost tender, as if it felt his pain, his confusion. I wanted to reach out to tell him I understood, but the distance between us was a chasm carved by years of misunderstanding. Dan set the letter down, its edges curling slightly as if it carried the weight of Brianna's soul. There's one final note, he said, his voice quieter now, almost reverent. Brianna asked me to emphasize that this decision wasn't made in haste. She spent months reflecting, consulting with advisors, ensuring her wishes were clear. She loved you both deeply in different ways, and this letter is her attempt to make things right. The room was silent save for the clock's tick, and the hum's fading echo, now a gentle pulse like a heartbeat settling after a storm. I looked at Dustin, his face a mask of pain and disbelief, and felt a surge of compassion. A father's instinct to comfort even after all he'd said. But he stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, his voice raw. This isn't over, he said, his eyes burning into Dan's. I'll have my lawyers review every word of this. She was sick, manipulated something. Nobody does this without a reason. Dustin, I said softly, finding my voice, the hum lending me its strength. This is what she wanted. Maybe it's not about us fighting, but about us listening. He turned to me, his eyes blazing, but there was a crack in his armor, a flicker of doubt. You don't get to lecture me, he said, but his voice lacked the fire it had before, replaced by a hollow ache. You got everything, I got nothing. You got a chance? I said, the words spilling out steady and true. She's giving you a chance to be more than her shadow, to be your own man. He stared at me, his breath uneven, then turned and stormed out the door, slamming behind him with a finality that echoed in my bones. The hum faded to a whisper, as if it had done its work, leaving me with the weight of Brianna's words, her love, her regret. Dan folded the letter, slipping it back into its envelope, his eyes meeting mine with a quiet understanding. She always spoke highly of you, Jerry, he said, his voice soft. Even after the divorce, she'd mention you in passing, your steadiness, your heart. She said you were the one thing she got wrong. I nodded, unable to speak, the tears still wet on my cheeks. The hum was gone now, replaced by a stillness that felt like peace, like a wound finally beginning to heal. Brianna had seen me, not the failure Dustin painted, not the relic her world dismissed, but the man who'd loved her through everything, who'd carried that love like a torch in the dark. Her letter wasn't just an explanation. It was a redemption, a recognition of the strength I'd doubted for years. I stood, my legs unsteady but my heart resolute, the weight of her bequest no longer crushing but empowering. The office seemed brighter now, the dust motes dancing again, as if the spirits my grandmother spoke of were satisfied. Whatever lay ahead, managing her empire, facing Dustin's anger, stepping into a world I'd never sought, I was ready. Not because of the money, but because of the truth Brianna had given me. I was enough, and I always had been. The door's echo from Dustin's departure lingered in Dan Morrison's office, a sharp note that faded into the stillness, leaving only the soft tick of the antique clock and the faint hum that had guided me through this storm. The envelope with Brianna's letter lay on Dan's desk, its wax seal broken, but its weight still palpable, as if her presence lingered in the room watching, waiting. I sat there, the $33.5 million, and the control of her empire settling over me like a mantle I hadn't asked for, but could no longer deny. The hum was quieter now, a gentle whisper like a breeze after a tempest urging me to step forward into the life Brianna had entrusted to me. Dan leaned back in his chair, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the afternoon light, his expression a mix of professional detachment and quiet empathy. That was intense. He said, his voice soft, almost as if he were speaking to himself. Dustin's reaction was not unexpected, but I'm sorry you had to endure it. I knotted my throat tight with the aftershocks of Brianna's letter, her words still echoing in my mind. You were the heart of our family, Jerry, and I didn't see it until it was too late. The tears had dried on my cheeks, but the warmth of her recognition remained a balm for wounds I'd carried for 15 years. He's hurting, I said, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. He thinks he's lost her, and in a way he has. But she's given him a chance to find himself. Dan's eyes softened, a rare crack in his lawyerly armor. Brianna believed that. She spent hours talking about you both, about what she wanted this will to mean. For Dustin, it's a challenge to grow. For you, it's something else. A recognition, maybe even a restoration. I looked at the envelope, its cream paper glowing faintly in the slanting light, and felt the hum pulse once more, a final note of affirmation. My grandmother's voice whispered unbidden, "The spirits honor those who endure, Jerry. They weave justice in their own time." I'd spent years believing I was the man who'd failed, the one who couldn't keep up with Brianna's fire or Dustin's ambition. But her letter had rewritten that story, revealing a truth I'd forgotten. My strength wasn't in wealth or titles, but in the quiet acts of love and resilience, the steady hand that kept the lights on both literally and figuratively. Dustin's threats of lawsuits lingered in the air, but they felt hollow now, like the last gasps of a storm that had already passed. Will he fight this? I asked, glancing at Dan. He might try, Dan said, stacking the documents with practiced precision. But Brianna was meticulous. Every clause, every condition was airtight. She knew Dustin's temperament and planned for it. The competency evaluations, the witnesses, the notarized revisions, it's all ironclad. He'd be fighting a losing battle. I nodded, my gaze drifting to the window where the clouds had parted fully now, revealing a sky streaked with gold and violet like a canvas painted by unseen hands. The hum was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt like peace, a resolution woven into the fabric of this moment. I thought of Dustin storming out with his anger and parcin, and felt a pang of hope, not for reconciliation, not yet, but for the possibility that Brianna's challenge would reach him, that he'd learn to build his own path to forgive the father he'd dismissed. Thank you, Dan, I said, standing my legs steadier than they'd been in days. For everything. He rose, extending a hand, his grip firm but warm. You're welcome, Jerry. And for what it's worth, Brianna believed in you. She said you were the one person she could trust to carry this forward, not just her wealth, but her legacy. She said you'd know what to do. I shook his hand, feeling a spark of purpose ignite within me, a strength I'd carried all along but never fully claimed. As I stepped out of the office, the Victorian house seemed to exhale its shadows softer, now the air lighter. The streets of Rock Springs glowed in the fading light, the town feeling different, as if it had witnessed my transformation and approved. Back in my apartment, I stood at the kitchen sink, the shards of the broken mug still scattered on the counter, their edges catching the last rays of sunlight. I didn't sweep them away. They were a reminder not of failure but of resilience, of a life pieced together through love and loss, of a strength that endured when everything else fell apart. The coffee stain on the linoleum had dried a map of forgotten battles, but it no longer felt like a mark of defeat. It was part of my story, just as Brianna's bequest was, just as Dustin's pain was. I thought of the company, the millions, the weight of a legacy I'd never sought. They were daunting, yes, but not crushing. I'd spent decades keeping the power grid running, balancing delicate systems to serve thousands. This was just another grid, another system to tend, and I'd do it my way, with care, with purpose, with the heart Brianna had seen in me. I'd use her wealth to create something good, something lasting, not for glory, but for the people it could help scholarships, community programs, second chances for those who'd been overlooked like I had. As for Dustin, I pictured him out there wrestling with his mother's words, her challenge to become more than her shadow. I didn't know if he'd forgive me or if he'd ever see me as more than the man he'd dismissed, but I'd be here steady as always, ready to meet him halfway if he chose to try. Brianna had given us both a gift, not just money, but truth, a chance to heal what we'd broken. The sky outside my window was clear now, stars beginning to prick through the twilight, each one a light in the dark, steady and enduring. I felt the weight of the past lift, replaced by a quiet certainty, a power I'd carried all along but only now recognized. Justice wasn't about revenge or recognition. It was about seeing the truth, about honoring the love that had shaped me even through betrayal. I was Jerry Flores, the man who kept the lights on, who loved without reward, who stood firm in the storm. And that was enough. I turned from the window, leaving the mug's shards where they lay, a testament to a life that had weathered its cracks and come out whole. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years I faced it with peace, ready to carry Brianna's legacy not as a burden, but as a promise fulfilled.